The heavy weight of the ring box in my pocket reminded me of what this day was supposed to mean. 5 years of marriage. 5 years of building a life together. 5 years of deception. I adjusted the white tablecloth one last time, making sure the creases fell perfectly. The flickering candles cast dancing shadows across the dining room of our penthouse apartment, the home we'd chosen together. The bottle of Chateau Margaux 2015 stood open, breathing, waiting for a celebration that would never come. Just one more hour, I whispered to myself, checking my watch. According to my flight itinerary, the one I'd forwarded to Victoria this morning, I should be halfway to Boston by now, preparing for tomorrow's non-existent business meeting. The screen of my phone lit up with a notification. I didn't need to check it to know what it said. The tracking app I'd installed on Victoria's phone 3 months ago would be alerting me to her location. For someone supposedly working late at an office that closed promptly at 6, she was spending an awful lot of time at Le Bleu restaurant. I ran my fingers over the petals of the red roses arranged carefully in the center of the table. Victoria's favorite flowers. Next to them sat her favorite dish, beef Wellington with truffle sauce, that I'd spent hours preparing from scratch. A dinner worthy of our anniversary. An anniversary I'd known for weeks she had no intention of celebrating with me. My phone buzzed with a text message. Victoria's name appeared on the screen. Sorry, darling. The Anderson project is a disaster. I'll be working late tonight. Don't wait up. Hope your flight was smooth. Love you. I read it twice, amazed at how the words no longer stung. After months of suspicion, weeks of evidence, and days of certainty, I felt nothing but a cold, calculated purpose. I typed back a quick response about turbulence and missing her, maintaining the charade. Leaving the untouched dinner behind, I grabbed the keys to the company car I'd borrowed, not my usual BMW that Victoria might recognize, and headed for Le Bleu. The restaurant sat nestled between high-end boutiques in the historical part of the city, its blue awnings visible from blocks away. I parked across the street, positioning myself with a clear view of the entrance and the window table where Victoria sat. She looked stunning in a black dress I'd never seen before, her long dark hair cascading over her shoulders. Opposite her sat a man I recognized from photographs on her hidden social media account, Mark, her supposed colleague. His hand rested on hers as he slid a small box across the table. Through the viewfinder of my camera, I zoomed in to capture the moment clearly. Victoria's eyes widened with delight as she opened the box to reveal a diamond bracelet that sparkled even from this distance. She leaned across the table, their lips meeting in a kiss that lasted far too long for colleagues. I took several photographs, each click of the shutter feeling like another nail in the coffin of our marriage. When they pulled apart, both laughing, I lowered the camera. I had seen enough. The drive home felt surreal, like I was floating outside my body. Our apartment, soon to be just hers, looked different now, the warm lighting I'd arranged for our romantic dinner now seeming more like the illumination of a stage set. All this time, I'd been performing in a play without knowing the script. I walked past our anniversary dinner, not bothering to clear anything away. Let her see what she had missed, what she had thrown away. In our bedroom, I packed only what I needed: clothes for a few days, toiletries, my laptop, and the hard drive containing months of evidence. Nothing sentimental. Nothing that would remind me of her. Before leaving, I took one last look at the home we had built together. 5 years of memories lingered in every corner. The couch where we'd spent lazy Sundays, the kitchen where we'd cooked together, the balcony where we'd watched countless sunsets. All tainted now. I locked the door behind me and drove to the one place Victoria knew nothing about. A remote mountain property purchased 6 months ago through a shell company. My secret fortress, built not out of love but out of suspicion that had tragically proven correct. As I drove up the winding mountain road, the city lights faded behind me. Ahead, only darkness and the dim outline of my new beginning. 5 years had ended tonight, but my real plan was just beginning. The mountain road narrowed as I climbed higher, headlights cutting through the dense darkness. After an hour of driving, the GPS announced my arrival with a soft chime. I pulled up to the electronic gate, punched in the code, and watched as it silently slid open, revealing the sanctuary I'd created for this exact moment. The house emerged from the shadows as motion-sensing lights activated along the driveway. From the outside, it looked like a modern mountain retreat, expansive glass windows reflecting the moonlight, sleek lines merging with the natural landscape. No one who saw it would guess its true purpose. I parked in the garage and gathered my few belongings. The house welcomed me with programmed warmth, lights gradually illuminating as I moved through each room. I dropped my bag in the master bedroom, not bothering to unpack. That could wait. What couldn't wait was setting everything in motion. At the back of a walk-in closet, I pressed my palm against a seemingly normal wall panel. A soft beep, a click, and the panel slid away, revealing a staircase descending into darkness. My footsteps echoed as I made my way down into what I'd come to think of as my war room. The bunker hummed with electronic life. Banks of servers and monitors lined the walls, each screen displaying different information. Bank accounts, security footage, email archives, phone records. 6 months of preparation, all for this night. I sat in the ergonomic chair at the center of it all and began typing, initializing what I'd named the divorce protocol. First, the financial safeguards. With a few keystrokes, I froze all our joint accounts and credit cards. Victoria would discover this soon enough, probably tomorrow morning over breakfast with her lover. "Sorry about that, sweetheart," I muttered, watching the confirmation messages appear on screen. Budget cuts. Next, I called up the security footage from our apartment. I'd installed hidden cameras months ago, not in some voyeuristic hope of catching them in the act, but to gather irrefutable evidence of conversations, plans, schemes. The dining room remained as I'd left it, the romantic dinner sitting cold and untouched. I reached for the bottle of whiskey I kept down here and poured myself 2 fingers. The amber liquid burned pleasantly as I swallowed, steadying my nerves for what came next. My phone buzzed. A text from Oleg, my attorney and former college roommate. "Protocol activated at the bank. All accounts secured. She'll have no access by morning. Are you sure about this?" I typed back, "Completely. Proceed as planned." On one of the monitors, I pulled up a live feed from her apartment building's security cameras. A taxi pulled up and Victoria emerged, stumbling slightly, laughing as Mark steadied her with his arm around her waist. They looked happy, carefree. The way we once looked. I switched to the interior cameras as they entered the apartment. Victoria's expression when she saw the anniversary setup was priceless. Confusion, then shock, then panic as she realized I'd known she wouldn't be working late. She rushed to check the bedroom, discovering my open drawers and missing possessions. "He knows," she said to Mark, her voice coming through clearly on my speakers. "He fucking knows." Mark pulled her into his arms. "Calm down. So what if he knows? This just speeds up our timeline." I turned up the volume as they moved to the living room, Mark pouring them both generous glasses of the wine I'd left open. "To your freedom," he toasted, clinking his glass against hers. Victoria smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I just didn't want it to happen like this. I wanted to control how it ended." "You mean you wanted to clean him out first?" Mark laughed, loosening his tie. "Speaking of which, did you transfer the money from that account I showed you?" My hand tightened around the whiskey glass. This wasn't just an affair. This was calculated, strategic. Victoria nodded. 800,000. He'll never notice until the quarterly review, and by then we'll be long gone. My stomach clenched, but I forced myself to keep watching as they continued discussing their plans, how they'd been siphoning money from my company for months, how Victoria had been copying sensitive files from my laptop when I was asleep, how Mark had connections to sell the information to my competitors. This wasn't just betrayal. This was corporate espionage. I reached for my phone and sent a message to another number, my head of security. "Check account transfers for the last 3 months. Focus on foreign transactions. We've been compromised." Then I leaned back in my chair, the full scope of Victoria's deception finally clear. This wasn't about love or passion. It was about money. My money. And they'd been playing me for a fool. I opened my laptop and began documenting everything, time-stamping each video clip, each incriminating statement. By morning I'd have enough evidence to destroy them both, not just in divorce court but possibly in criminal court as well. "Game on," I whispered to the screens, raising my glass in a bitter toast. Morning arrived with the harsh glare of mountain sunlight streaming through the panoramic windows. I'd barely slept, spending most of the night documenting evidence and fine-tuning the next phases of my plan. My eyes burned from staring at screens, but adrenaline kept me alert. Today was the day Victoria would begin to understand the consequences of her actions. I brewed a strong cup of coffee and settled in front of the main surveillance monitor. Through my hidden cameras, I watched as Victoria woke up alone in our bed. Mark had left sometime after midnight, smart enough not to stay overnight where neighbors might see him. She reached for her phone immediately, probably checking if I'd called or texted. Her expression tightened when she saw nothing. Watching her morning routine felt invasive yet necessary. She showered, dressed in an expensive outfit I'd paid for, and prepared a light breakfast. Everything seemed normal until she reached for her purse and pulled out her wallet. I leaned forward, a grim smile forming. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. Victoria and Mark had planned to meet for breakfast at Café Laurent, a trendy spot downtown where they thought nobody knew them. I discovered their regular breakfast dates weeks ago. Through my cameras, I watched her grab her keys and leave the apartment, completely unaware of what awaited her. Switching feeds to the cafe's exterior camera, a system I'd gained access to through a friendly connection with the security company, I observed Victoria arriving, checking her makeup in her compact mirror before heading inside. 20 minutes later, Mark arrived, kissing her cheek before sitting down. They looked like any normal couple enjoying breakfast, laughing over coffee, his hand occasionally covering hers on the table. The waitress brought their order, and after finishing their meal, Victoria reached for her purse. I didn't need audio to understand what happened next. Victoria's smile faltered as she swiped her card once, twice, 3 times. The waitress shook her head apologetically. Victoria tried another card. Same result. The color drained from her face as she tried a third card, then a fourth. Mark's expression shifted from confusion to concern. He reached for his wallet, handling the bill himself, but the damage was done. Victoria was frantically checking her banking app, her fingers tapping urgently against the screen. My phone rang. It was Oleg. She just called the bank, he said without preamble. They informed her all joint accounts have been frozen pending an investigation into suspicious activity. She didn't take it well. I imagine not, I replied, watching as Victoria and Mark exited the cafe, her body language tense, his posture protective but wary. What about her private accounts? Those too. The fraud department is very concerned about the unusual transactions to offshore accounts over the past few months. They've assured her it could take weeks to resolve. I thanked him and hung up, switching to another camera feed. This one showed Victoria's mother's boutique, a small but exclusive clothing store that I'd financed with a family loan 2 years ago. By noon, they would receive formal notice that the loan was being called due immediately. Another financial anchor around Victoria's neck. My phone buzzed with a text from Mark's number to Victoria. We've been made. Anton says someone accessed the offshore account. Need to accelerate everything. Meet me at my place in an hour. Anton. A name I didn't recognize. Another player in their scheme. I reached for my secure phone, one Victoria knew nothing about, and called Sergey, the private detective I'd hired 8 months ago when my suspicions first crystallized. I need everything on someone named Anton connected to Mark Levin, I said when he answered. Priority 1. On it, Sergey replied. Also, you should know they've been moving faster than anticipated. The last batch of corporate files was copied yesterday afternoon from your home server. My jaw tightened. Track it. I want to know where those files went. While waiting for Victoria to return home, I activated the next phase. A simple text message to our building's security with my authorization code, requesting an immediate change to all access protocols. Victoria's biometrics and key cards would no longer work by the time she returned. I didn't have to wait long. Within an hour, my cameras showed Victoria's car pulling into our building's garage. She looked composed but pale, clutching her phone as she walked to the private elevator. When her fingerprint failed to call the elevator, confusion crossed her face. She tried again. Nothing. The security guard approached her, and though I couldn't hear their conversation, I could read the shock and disbelief in her body language. She gestured wildly, pointed to herself, likely explaining that she lived there. The guard handed her an envelope, the one Oleg had prepared containing formal notice of eviction and a copy of our prenuptial agreement with its recent insurance policy amendment. Victoria's hands trembled as she opened it. As she read, her knees seemed to buckle slightly, forcing her to lean against the wall for support. The first strike had landed perfectly. And this was just the beginning. The mountain property felt different in daylight, less like a fortress and more like what it was meant to appear as, a luxury retreat. I almost laughed at the irony as I prepared for my meeting with Sergey. 8 months ago, I'd hired him on a hunch, a nagging suspicion that something wasn't right in my marriage. Now I was about to learn just how deep the deception went. The security system announced Sergey's arrival with a soft chime. I bussed him through the gate and waited by the door. He pulled up in his nondescript sedan, a man whose entire professional existence depended on being forgettable. Average height, average build, unremarkable features. The perfect detective. Nice place, he commented as he entered, his eyes professionally scanning the surroundings. Very private. That's the point, I replied, leading him to the living room where I'd set up a projector. What have you got for me? Sergey placed his laptop on the coffee table and connected it to the projector. You might want to pour yourself something strong, he suggested, typing in his password. This gets complicated. The wall filled with a complex network diagram, photos and names connected by colored lines indicating relationships, financial transactions, communications. Mark Levin, Sergey began, highlighting a photograph of Victoria's lover. 36 years old, IT security consultant. Or that's what his LinkedIn profile says. In reality, he's been involved in 3 similar operations in the past 5 years. My stomach tightened. Operations. Corporate espionage with a personal twist. He cultivates relationships with spouses of high-level executives, gains their trust, and uses them to access company data. Sergey clicked to another slide showing 3 different men. These executives all experienced significant data breaches. 2 of their companies collapsed within a year. The room seemed to spin slightly. And Victoria? Was she a victim too? Sergey's expression hardened. No. She was a willing participant from the beginning. He brought up security footage from a spa resort, the exclusive one Victoria had visited last year for what she'd called a girls' weekend. This woman, he pointed to a slim blonde greeting Victoria in the lobby, is Natasha Kern. She's worked with Mark on at least 2 previous jobs. She made the introduction. The footage showed Victoria and Natasha talking animatedly in the spa lounge, then being joined by Mark, the meeting clearly prearranged. Nothing about their body language suggested a first encounter. They planned this, I said, the words feeling hollow in my mouth. From the very beginning. Yes. And they've been methodical. Sergey brought up financial records showing systematic transfers from my company accounts to shell corporations. Over the past 6 months, they've extracted approximately $1.2 million. I ran a hand over my face, feeling the stubble from not shaving this morning. What about Anton? Anton Karlov. Their technical specialist. A photo appeared of a thin man with thick glasses. Former cybersecurity expert turned corporate raider. He creates the backdoors, builds the data extraction software. Based on the communications we've intercepted, he's been installing malware through your home network. Through Victoria's laptop, I realized. She always insisted on having her own instead of using company equipment. Said she needed it for her design projects. Perfect cover. She connects to your home network, the malware spreads, giving them access to anything connected to that network including your company servers when you work from home. I leaned back against the couch, processing the information. This wasn't just a betrayal of our marriage. This was a calculated attack on everything I'd built. I need to show you something else, Sergey said, his tone gentler. He pulled up a video file. This was recorded 3 months ago at a hotel in the city. The footage showed Victoria and Mark in a hotel room, but they weren't intimate. They were working, surrounded by papers, laptops open. We're looking at another easy $2 million from the Patterson contract, Victoria was saying, pointing to something on the screen. Artem trusts me completely. He'll never suspect I'm the one who copied his presentation drafts. Mark laughed. That's because he thinks with his heart, not his head. Too trusting for his own good. Victoria smiled in a way I'd never seen, cold, calculating. That's why I married him. That and the money, of course. The video continued, but I'd seen enough. I signaled for Sergey to stop it. When did you know? I asked him. When did you know it wasn't just an affair? About 6 months ago when she first met with Karlov. The pattern became clear. Sergey closed his laptop. I've prepared a complete dossier for your attorneys. Every transaction, every communication we've intercepted, every piece of evidence showing criminal intent. I nodded, already mentally planning my next moves. I need to contact my business partners, warn them about potential vulnerabilities. Already drafted the security brief, Sergey said, handing me a flash drive. Full audit recommendations, systems to check, protocols to change. I took the drive, feeling the weight of it in my palm, the physical manifestation of everything I needed to protect what remained of my life. One more thing, Sergey added. The police fraud division has been quietly building a case against Karlov for months. They'd be very interested in what we've uncovered. For the first time in days, I felt something close to satisfaction. Then let's make sure they get everything they need. The cheap motel room stank of cigarettes and desperation. I watched through my surveillance feed as Victoria paced back and forth, her designer shoes incongruous against the stained carpet. Mark sat on the edge of the bed, hunched over his laptop, his usual confident demeanor replaced by tense concentration. Everything's gone, Victoria said, her voice trembling with rage. Every account frozen, every card declined. He even called in my mother's loan. Her business will collapse by the end of the month. Mark barely looked up. Focus, Victoria. We need a new strategy, not complaints. I took a sip of coffee, noting how quickly their relationship had changed under pressure. Just days ago they had been lovers celebrating over expensive wine. Now they looked like what they truly were, accomplices in a failing scheme. What about the offshore accounts? Victoria asked, sitting beside him. Compromised. Anton's working on establishing new ones, but it'll take time. Mark rubbed his eyes. Your husband is more thorough than we anticipated. Victoria laughed bitterly. He was always meticulous. I used to find it boring. I wondered if she found it quite so boring now. They fell silent as Mark continued typing. Victoria pulled out her phone, scrolling through what looked like news articles. We could use this, she said suddenly, holding up her screen to show Mark. Artem's company avoided an audit last year after donating to the mayor's campaign. We could suggest tax evasion. Mark's expression brightened. That's good. We need leverage. He took the phone, examining the article. We don't need to prove anything. Just create enough suspicion to force him to negotiate. I made a note to have my accountants prepare for potential scrutiny, though I knew my company's finances were impeccable. Victoria had never understood my insistence on ethical business practices, viewing them as unnecessary constraints. What about this? Victoria's voice dropped to a whisper as she leaned closer to Mark. What if I claimed he was abusive? My blood ran cold. Domestic violence? Mark considered this, nodding slowly. That could work. It would damage his reputation regardless of proof. Victoria stood up, walking to the bathroom. I know a makeup artist who works in film. She could make it look convincing. I watched in disbelief as she outlined her plan to appear in public with fake injuries, to file police reports, to create a narrative of abuse that would force me to pay her off to avoid scandal. My phone buzzed with a text from Oleg. They're desperate. We should expect something dramatic soon. Already happening, I texted back, attaching a clip of Victoria's conversation with Mark. I continued watching as they refined their plan. Mark drafted an email demanding $3 million in settlement money, to avoid both tax fraud accusations and domestic abuse allegations. The desperation in their planning was palpable. Send it, Victoria said when they finished. And tell him we want a meeting. Face to face. Mark raised an eyebrow. Is that wise? I know him. He'll want to look me in the eyes to understand why I did it. She smiled coldly. Let him have that. It might be the last satisfaction he gets. 2 hours later, the email arrived in my inbox, its threatening tone almost laughable given what I knew. I forwarded it to Oleg with the simple message, let's meet them. Oleg called immediately. Are you sure that's wise? They're cornered animals now. Exactly why I want to see them. I want to know how far they're willing to go. I paused, considering. Arrange it at Osteria. Neutral ground, public enough to keep things civil, private enough for our purposes. I'll have security nearby, Oleg said, his tone making it clear this wasn't a suggestion. Fine, I agreed. But make sure they're discreet. The next evening I arrived at Osteria 30 minutes early, choosing a table in the back corner with a clear view of the entrance. I wore a simple gray suit, nothing flashy, nothing that suggested either wealth or defeat. Oleg sat at the bar, pretending to be a stranger while keeping the table in his peripheral vision. Victoria arrived first, wearing dark sunglasses despite the evening hour. When she removed them, I saw the bruises around her left eye, skillfully applied but obvious to anyone who knew what to look for. She'd brought an older man with her lawyer, I presumed. Artem, she said, her voice carefully modulated to sound both strong and vulnerable. The perfect victim. Victoria, I replied simply, not rising to greet her. And who's this? Robert Klein, Mrs. Sorokin's legal counsel, the man said, extending his hand which I deliberately ignored. They sat down across from me, Victoria's lawyer placing a thick folder on the table between us. Through the window I spotted Mark watching from a car across the street. I believe you received our communication, Klein began. I smiled, reaching into my jacket to retrieve a folder of my own. Yes. And I've prepared a response. Victoria's lawyer pulled out a document with official-looking letterhead. My client is prepared to keep certain matters private if we can come to a reasonable arrangement, he began, his voice carrying the practiced smoothness of someone used to thinly veiled threats. I maintained an expression of polite interest, letting them play out their hand. Victoria dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, the perfect picture of a wounded spouse. $3 million is hardly reasonable, I replied calmly. especially for accusations with no basis in fact. The lawyer stiffened. Mrs. Sorokin has extensive documentation of both financial irregularities in your company and of the unfortunate domestic situation. Victoria leaned forward, her voice dropping to a theatrical whisper. Please, Artem. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. I just want what's fair after what you've done to me. I almost admired her commitment to the performance. Almost. What I've done to you, I repeated, nodding as though considering her words. Then I opened my folder and placed a series of photographs on the table. Like celebrating our anniversary alone while you were with your lover? Her eyes widened at the clear image of her and Mark at Lublu, caught mid-kiss. Or perhaps you mean discovering that my wife has been systematically stealing from my company? I laid down printed bank statements showing the transfers to offshore accounts. Victoria's lawyer frowned, glancing at her with the first hint of doubt. One photograph proves nothing, Victoria recovered quickly. And those transfers were authorized. You gave me access. I also have this, I interrupted, sliding across a USB drive. 87 hours of recorded conversations between you, Mark Levin, and Anton Karlov, discussing in detail how you plan to ruin me professionally and personally. The color drained from Victoria's face. You recorded me? That's illegal. Not in my own home, with visible disclosure in the property agreement you signed last year. I smiled thinly. The clause about security systems and monitoring? You really should read what you signed, Victoria. Her lawyer reached for the USB drive. I'd like to review this alleged evidence. Be my guest. The police already have copies. I checked my watch. In fact, they should be arresting Mr. Karlov right about now. Corporate espionage carries significant penalties these days. As if on cue, my phone vibrated with a text from Sergey. K in custody. M being tracked. Victoria's composure cracked. You're bluffing. I pulled out my phone and played a video clip, Victoria in our bedroom, laughing as she explained to Mark how my passwords worked, where I kept sensitive documents, which servers contain the most valuable intellectual property. Does this look like a bluff? I asked, turning to her lawyer. Mr. Klein, you should know that continuing to represent Mrs. Sorokin in what is now clearly an attempted extortion could have implications for your license to practice. Klein gathered his papers, his professional demeanor faltering. I need to consult with my client privately. Of course. I gestured toward a quiet corner of the restaurant. Take your time. As they moved away, I saw Victoria's desperate glance toward the window. Mark's car was no longer there. My phone buzzed again with a text from Oleg. I'm on the move. Heading to airport. I forwarded this to Sergey with the instruction. Make sure he doesn't get far. Victoria returned alone, her makeup now smeared from genuine tears. Robert's withdrawing from the case, she said, her voice small. Wise decision. She sat down heavily, all pretense gone. What do you want, Artem? What do I want? I repeated, considering the question. I want back the 5 years I wasted. I want to undo the damage you've done to my company. I want to understand how you could share my bed while plotting my destruction. Her shoulders slumped. It wasn't personal. I laughed without humor. Marriage is the definition of personal, Victoria. Mark said you'd never notice. That you were too trusting, too in love. She looked up, meeting my eyes for the first time. He was wrong about that, wasn't he? I trusted you completely, I admitted. Until I didn't. Victoria reached across the table, a desperate gambit. We could start over. I could help you get everything back from Mark and Anton. I know all their contacts, their methods. I stood up, buttoning my jacket. The authorities already have that information. You've nothing left to bargain with. As I turned to leave, she grabbed my arm. What happens to me now? That depends on the prosecutor's office, I said, gently removing her hand. And on how cooperative you choose to be. Outside, Oleg fell into step beside me. Mark Levin was detained at airport security. Apparently, he was traveling with multiple passports and significant cash. And Victoria's friend, Natasha? Located in Prague. Interpol has been notified of her connection to similar operations. I nodded, feeling the weight of the past few days pressing down. What about the company? Emergency board meeting scheduled for tomorrow morning. The preliminary security audit shows the damage is containable. As we reached my car, I took one last look at the restaurant where Victoria sat alone, staring blankly at the evidence of her crimes. She never expected you to fight back, Oleg observed. None of them did. That was their mistake, I said, sliding into the driver's seat. They thought they were hunting, but they never realized they were the prey. The local news website broke the story first. Tech CEO uncovers corporate espionage ring led by own wife. Within hours, it spread to business publications, then mainstream media. I watched from my mountain retreat as the carefully crafted narrative unfolded exactly as planned. The statement my PR team had prepared, providing just enough detail to satisfy curiosity while protecting company interests. My phone hadn't stopped buzzing since the news broke. Friends, business associates, acquaintances, all reaching out with messages of support and disbelief. Even people Victoria and I had considered mutual friends were firmly choosing sides. "Did you see Elena's post?" Oleg asked during our morning briefing. She shared the news article and wrote quite the passionate defense of you. Elena had been Victoria's closest friend, or so I'd thought. I pulled up her social media profile and read her public message. Shocked and disgusted to learn the truth about Victoria. Artem has always been nothing but generous and kind. Some people just can't recognize genuine goodness when they have it. The comments below were filled with similar sentiments. People who had attended our dinner parties and charity events now openly condemning Victoria while expressing sympathy for me. The court of public opinion had rendered its verdict without waiting for the actual trial. "She's getting threats," Sergey reported, sliding a folder across my desk. "Nothing serious yet, but people who lost money in your company's temporary stock dip are looking for someone to blame." I flipped through the printouts of messages directed at Victoria. The vitriol surprised even me. "Make sure she has security," I said. "Whatever else she's done, I don't want her physically harmed." Sergey nodded, making a note. "She's selling her jewelry. The designer pieces you bought her over the years. It's barely enough to cover her legal fees." A knock at the door interrupted us. My assistant entered with a tablet displaying the latest security footage from my former apartment building. Victoria was arguing with the concierge, trying to retrieve some personal items. The building management, following my instructions, was allowing her only supervised access for 30 minutes. I watched her collect photographs, some clothes, and a few keepsakes. She looked diminished somehow, her usual confident posture replaced by a defensive slouch. The luxury handbag she carried was one I recognized, the last birthday gift I'd given her before discovering her betrayal. "Her boutique is closed," Oleg reported. "The landlord terminated the lease when she missed this month's payment. Her clients are canceling orders, demanding refunds." I turned away from the footage. "What about the interview requests?" 17 so far, my assistant replied. "Everything from morning shows to investigative programs. They all want your side of the story." "Decline them all," I said firmly. "We stick to the written statement. This isn't entertainment, it's my life." Later that afternoon, I received an unexpected call from my mother. We hadn't spoken since I'd informed her of the situation a week ago. "Victoria called me," she said without preamble, "begging me to intervene to convince you to drop the charges." I closed my eyes, pinching the bridge of my nose. "And what did you tell her?" "That I always knew she wasn't good enough for you." My mother's voice carried the particular satisfaction of someone who had been right all along. I never trusted that practiced charm of hers. "You never said anything." "Would you have listened?" she countered. "You were infatuated. Sometimes people need to learn certain lessons for themselves." After we hung up, I stood at the window overlooking the mountains, wondering if I should have seen the signs earlier. Had I been willfully blind to Victoria's true nature, or had she simply been that good at deception? My phone rang again, the head of my development team requesting authorization for an emergency protocol change to secure our systems against any further intrusions. As I worked through the technical details with him, I realized the team had organized a surprise for me. "We're all here at the office," he said, putting the call on speaker. A chorus of voices called out greetings and encouragement. "We've got your back, boss. No one messes with our company. We're staying late to fix everything, pizza's on the way." The unexpected show of loyalty caught me off guard. While Victoria's social world collapsed, mine seemed to be rallying around me. The contrast couldn't have been starker. After the call, I instructed my assistant to arrange a company-wide bonus and a personal thank you note to each team member. Then I opened my email to find a message from an investigative journalist with a subject line that made my blood run cold: Victoria Sorokin's previous identities. The message contained evidence that Victoria had changed her name twice before we met, and had been implicated in at least 2 other financial schemes under her former identities. Attached were photographs of a younger Victoria with different hair colors, different names, but the same calculating look in her eyes. The woman I had married, the woman I had loved, had never existed at all. As I forwarded the email to my legal team, my security system chimed with an alert. Victoria was attempting to call my private number from a borrowed phone. I watched the notification flash, considered answering, then deliberately declined the call. Some bridges couldn't be rebuilt. Some betrayals went too deep for words. The courthouse steps gleamed in the morning light, polished stone reflecting the cloudless blue sky. I adjusted my tie, a deep navy, conservative and serious, as Oleg reviewed our final strategy. Today would mark the official end of my marriage, though in truth it had ended the moment I saw Victoria kiss Mark through the restaurant window. The judge has reviewed all the evidence, Oleg said, his leather portfolio tucked under his arm. Given the circumstances, this should be straightforward. Straightforward. As if dissolving 5 years of marriage could ever be simple. Security escorted us through a side entrance to avoid the small cluster of reporters gathered at the main doors. Their presence surprised me. Divorce proceedings weren't typically newsworthy, but the corporate espionage angle had kept the story alive in the business press. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, the wood paneling giving it a solemn, almost claustrophobic atmosphere. I took my place at the plaintiff's table, Oleg arranging documents beside me with methodical precision. When Victoria entered, I almost didn't recognize her. Gone were the designer clothes and perfect makeup. She wore a simple navy dress that hung loosely on her frame, suggesting weight loss. Her hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and dark circles shadowed her eyes. Her attorney, not Robert Klein but a younger, less polished woman, whispered something in her ear as they sat at the defendant's table. Our eyes met briefly across the room. I searched for some sign of the woman I'd loved, but found only a wary stranger looking back at me. The bailiff called the court to order, and Judge Harriman entered, a stern-faced woman in her 60s whose reputation for fairness was matched only by her intolerance for wasted time. "Before we begin," she said after the formalities, "I want to be clear that while I am aware of the related criminal proceedings, today we are addressing only the dissolution of marriage and division of assets according to the prenuptial agreement and its amendments. Is that understood?" Both attorneys acknowledged her statement. Oleg presented our case first, his voice measured and professional as he outlined the terms of our prenuptial agreement and the amendment Victoria had signed. He methodically submitted evidence of Victoria's infidelity and her involvement in the corporate espionage scheme, establishing clear violation of the fidelity and criminal conduct clauses of our contract. My client requests dissolution of the marriage pursuant to Section 4 of the agreement, which stipulates that in case of infidelity combined with criminal activity against Mr. Sorokin or his business interests, Mrs. Sorokin forfeits all rights to marital property and financial support. Victoria's attorney rose, smoothing her slightly wrinkled blazer. "Your Honor, while my client acknowledges the extramarital relationship, we contest the validity of the amendment to the prenuptial agreement, which we believe was signed under false pretenses." Judge Harriman's expression remained neutral. "Please elaborate." Mrs. Sorokin was told she was signing updated insurance documents, not an amendment to her prenuptial agreement. This constitutes fraud in the inducement. I felt a flicker of anger at the accusation, but Oleg had prepared for this. "Your Honor, if I may," he interjected, activating a small tablet. "We have video documentation of Mrs. Sorokin signing the amendment, with clear verbal confirmation that she understood the nature of the document." The courtroom screen flickered to life, showing Victoria in our home office, elegantly dressed, smiling as she read through papers. My voice came clearly through the speakers. "This strengthens the protection for both of us in the prenup. Are you sure you understand everything?" On screen Victoria nodded. "Of course, darling. In sickness and in health, in fidelity and finances." She signed with a flourish, then looked up with a smile that now seemed hollow. "Though I don't know why we bother with all this legal nonsense. Nothing's going to come between us." The irony of her words hung heavy in the courtroom. Victoria stared at her hands, not watching the screen. Judge Harriman reviewed several more exhibits, including financial records showing Victoria's participation in diverting company funds. In the gallery behind us, I noticed several men I recognized, executives from companies that had previously been targeted by Mark and his accomplices. They had come to witness justice firsthand. "Mrs. Sorokin," the judge finally addressed Victoria directly, "do you wish to make a statement before I rule?" Victoria stood slowly, her composure fragile but intact. "I made terrible mistakes," she said, her voice barely carrying across the quiet room. "I became someone I never thought I could be. I don't expect forgiveness, but I want the court to know that I accept responsibility for my actions." Her words might have moved me once, but now they rang hollow against the mountain of evidence showing the calculated nature of her betrayal. Judge Harriman delivered her ruling with efficient clarity. Marriage dissolved, prenuptial agreement and its amendments upheld, all marital assets awarded according to its terms. Additionally, Victoria was ordered to pay my legal costs and a penalty for attempted fraud against the court in her filings. This matter is concluded, the judge declared, bringing down her gavel with a sharp crack that echoed through the courtroom. I felt no triumph, no vindication, only a weary relief that it was finally, officially over. As I stood to leave, I didn't look back at Victoria. That chapter of my life had closed. Outside, Oleg received a call that he quickly passed to me with a rare smile. "The patent office," he said. "About your new security protocol application." As I took the phone, I stepped into sunlight, hearing news of future success while leaving the shadows of betrayal behind. 2 years passed like the changing of seasons, gradually then suddenly complete. Standing at the window of my Swiss office, watching snowflakes drift onto the Alps, I barely recognized the man I had been during those dark days of discovery and divorce. The expansion of my company into the European market had been more successful than anyone predicted. The security protocol born from Victoria's betrayal had become our most profitable product, ironically transforming personal devastation into professional triumph. Companies around the world now protected themselves with systems designed to prevent exactly what had happened to me. My assistant knocked gently before entering. "The conference begins in 30 minutes, sir. Your keynote presentation is ready." I nodded, adjusting my cufflinks, a new pair, sterling silver with small sapphires. Nothing I'd owned during my marriage remained in my possession. I'd sold or donated everything, shedding material reminders like an old skin. The conference center buzzed with energy. Tech innovators from across Europe gathered to discuss the future of cybersecurity. As I reviewed my notes backstage, a woman approached, tall and poised, with intelligent eyes and a confident stride. "Mr. Sorokin? I'm Dr. Sofia Novak, presenting after you on robotic system vulnerabilities." She extended her hand. "I've been following your work on adaptive security protocols. Quite revolutionary." Her handshake was firm, her gaze direct. No artifice, no hidden agenda, just professional respect and genuine interest. "I look forward to your presentation," I replied, surprised at how easily the conversation flowed. The intersection of robotics and security presents fascinating challenges. Something sparked between us in that moment, not romance, not yet, but the recognition of aligned minds, of shared passion for innovation and integrity. After the conference, we continued our discussion over dinner, talking for hours about technology, ethics, the responsibility of creators to consider the consequences of their work. She listened to my experiences without judgment, offering insights without presumption. When I finally returned to my hotel that night, I realized I hadn't thought about Victoria once during the entire evening. Over the following months, Sophia and I developed a professional collaboration that gradually evolved into friendship. She never pushed for details about my past, but I found myself wanting to share them with her. On a crisp autumn evening in a quiet restaurant overlooking Lake Geneva, I finally told her everything: the betrayal, the espionage, the calculated dismantling of Victoria's scheme. "You built an entire security system just to catch her," Sophia said when I finished, wonder and concern mingling in her voice. "I built it to protect what was mine," I corrected gently. "The technology itself was never about revenge, only security." She considered this, her fingers tracing the rim of her wineglass. "And now? Is it still about protection, or has it become something more?" The question penetrated deeper than she knew. "Now it's about creating something that matters, something that helps others avoid what happened to me." Her smile held understanding beyond sympathy. "That's evolution, Artem. From personal pain to universal solution." While my life found new purpose, I occasionally received updates about Victoria through Sergey, who had become both my head of security and a trusted friend. "She's completed her community service," he reported during one of our weekly calls. "Working as a cleaner at the Grand Hotel." The irony wasn't lost on me, Victoria scrubbing bathrooms in the same luxury establishment where she'd once stayed as a pampered guest. Her criminal conviction had resulted in a suspended sentence contingent on community service and full restitution of the stolen funds, a leniency granted largely due to her cooperation in dismantling Mark and Anton's wider network. Life has a peculiar symmetry sometimes, a balance that asserts itself when we least expect it. That symmetry manifested itself most dramatically during a corporate dinner at the Grand Hotel itself, celebrating my company's new partnership with a major Swiss technology firm. Sophia accompanied me as both colleague and companion, our relationship having evolved into something neither of us had labeled but both cherished. We were laughing over dessert when I saw her, Victoria, pushing a cleaning cart down a service corridor. She wore a gray uniform, her hair hidden beneath a cap, but I would have known her anywhere. Our eyes met for a frozen moment across the opulent dining room. Recognition, shock, then something unreadable flashed across her face. Sophia noticed my distraction. "What is it?" she asked, turning to follow my gaze. "History," I replied as Victoria disappeared through a service door. Walking by. Later that night, I told Sophia the complete truth about who we'd seen. She listened without interruption, then asked the one question no one else had thought to pose: "Are you happy she's suffering, or would you prefer to be indifferent to her fate entirely?" The question lingered between us, profound in its simplicity. "2 years ago I wanted justice," I answered finally. "Now I just want peace." She nodded, understanding what I meant. True healing wasn't found in another's downfall, but in my own ability to continue forward without looking back. That night, as Sophia slept beside me, I realized how far both Victoria and I had traveled from our shared beginning, parallel paths leading to vastly different destinations. The Alpine wedding was everything my first had not been: intimate, genuine, uncluttered by social obligations or appearances. Beneath a canopy of pine trees with only 30 guests in attendance, Sophia and I exchanged vows that felt weightier, more considered than those I'd spoken 5 years earlier. "You don't have to sell the mountain house," Sophia had insisted when I first suggested it. "We can create new memories there." But some spaces remained too deeply marked by their origins. The fortress I'd built for surveillance and revenge couldn't become a home of trust and transparency, no matter how thoroughly we renovated. Instead, we found a centuries-old stone cottage overlooking Lake Geneva, its weathered walls holding generations of stories, none of which belonged to me. We spent weekends restoring it together, Sophia's practical engineering mind complementing my attention to detail. Unlike the cold surveillance hub in the mountains, every inch of this place we created jointly, hands equally covered in paint and plaster. "What do you think about converting the old boathouse into a lab space?" Sophia asked one morning over coffee on our terrace, the lake shimmering below us. I looked at the dilapidated structure at the water's edge. "It has potential. Good natural light, easy cooling from the water. We could work on the neural interface project together," she suggested, her eyes alight with the enthusiasm that had first drawn me to her. "Your security algorithms paired with my robotic response systems." This was the unexpected gift Sophia had brought into my life. Not just love but intellectual partnership. We challenged and complemented each other, turning individual expertise into something greater than its parts. Our joint laboratory became renowned in tech circles, producing innovations that merged robotics and security in ways previously unimagined. The trauma that had shaped my security systems found positive expression through Sophia's humanistic approach to technology. "We're creating protections with purpose," she often said, "not barriers built from fear." On the 1-year anniversary of our wedding, I finally did what I'd been considering for months. I established the Sorokin Foundation for Financial Literacy and Fraud Prevention, dedicating substantial resources to educating people about sophisticated scams and providing legal assistance to victims of financial predators. "Are you sure you want to use your name?" Sophia asked when I showed her the foundation documents. "Given everything that happened?" "That's precisely why," I explained. "I want to transform what Victoria and her accomplices tried to destroy into something that helps others." The foundation quickly gained attention, particularly for its educational programs teaching young professionals to recognize manipulation tactics in both personal and business relationships. I occasionally spoke at these seminars, sharing carefully edited versions of my experience. Each time, people approached afterward with their own stories of betrayal and recovery. Healing, I discovered, often comes through helping others navigate the same dark paths you've walked yourself. Throughout this period of growth and rebuilding, I maintained minimal awareness of Victoria's circumstances through Sergei's occasional updates. After completing her community service, she had moved to a smaller city, working as a waitress in a mid-range restaurant. She lived modestly in a studio apartment, a universe away from the luxury she had once considered her due. On a cold winter morning, an unexpected letter arrived bearing her name. I recognized her handwriting immediately. The elegant, flowing script that had once signed love notes now filled 2 pages with apologies, explanations, and finally, a request for financial help to start over properly. I read it twice, searching for manipulation or deceit but finding only desperation and perhaps genuine regret. After careful consideration, I wrote a check for a modest sum, enough to provide temporary stability but not excess, and enclosed it with a brief note. On new beginnings. Not for who you were, but for who you might become. Whether this represented forgiveness I couldn't say. Perhaps it was simply the final step in freeing myself completely from the past we had shared. That evening, as snow fell softly outside, Sophia and I sat before the fireplace discussing our future in ways that would have seemed impossible during the darkest days of betrayal and revenge. "I've been thinking," she said, her head resting against my shoulder, "about expanding our family." The suggestion caught me by surprise. After Victoria, I had closed that door in my mind, assuming the wounds too deep to risk such vulnerability again. Sophia watched the emotions cross my face, giving me space to process before adding, "We don't have to decide tonight. But I want you to know I'm ready when you are." I looked into the eyes of this remarkable woman who had helped me rebuild not just a life, but the capacity to trust. In her gaze was everything Victoria's had lacked: honesty, patience, true partnership. "I think," I said slowly, realizing the truth as the words formed, "I'm ready to talk about it." In that moment, with the fire crackling and future possibilities unfurling before us, I understood that the real victory over betrayal wasn't the elaborate revenge I'd engineered, but this, the capacity to move forward, to love again, to build something genuine on the ruins of what had been lost. That was the true new beginning.